You may have to change the picture.
Okay, get ready. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
You can see that our red berets have arrived. And we are resplendent in our red berets. Okay, and this, of course, okay, is Bonnie. I don't know whether you have seen her before, actually. Okay, but you can see that she's very lovely. Yes, Laura, you are in time. And so tonight we wanted to begin with a toast to the Red Berets, to the Red Berets group, and to the Red Berets as well. Hi, Russ. How are you? Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. We're very glad you like them. Carmen said, had to make coffee to catch this, however I'm here. Hiya, folks. Thanks, Carmen. Thanks for coming. And Dolores says hi. From YouTube. And Kay says hi, too. And Jim Bird says cheers. And Dolores says good evening. So, we also have two other Red Berets that Laura was very kind to send us. Those are more winter style Red Berets. Okay, I'm giving the very, very beautiful one to Bonnie. Look at that purple stitching in there. Here, honey.
Okay.
Oh, did we actually drink when we were supposed to? Let's. It's okay. I can put that over here.
I'm going to pick it up when I...
Okay.
See if I can get this one on.
Well, from what I can see here, it looks great. So, I think you're in real good shape. Okay, this one is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Scottish style. Looks like the kinds of berets that they wear on the golf courses in Scotland. I don't know if that's true, but yes, the red berets have arrived. They are made by Michel de Villiers, and they certainly are lovely.
Yes, they are.
Yes, they're very beautiful, and they're very rakish.
Rakish?
I can see you can tell. They make me look like a rake and rambling boy.
Let me see.
Bonnie wants to see. Oh, yeah. She's got the right idea about how to wear that, Carmen.
No, I don't.
That is beautiful. The crafter is so good. It is said that handmade items contain a piece of the maker's soul.
Oh, wow.
Well, it's certainly a very, very lovely and or handsome soul, indeed. What are the berets intended to mean? They're intended to symbolize the red, the thread that brings us all together in the Red Berets movement for Medicare for All. And Laura is explaining better than I could. A creative symbol of solidarity for national improved Medicare for all and for fighting on all fronts in order to achieve it. Hashtag capital F, capital O, capital A, capital F stands for fighting on all fronts. And it stands for solidarity too. Because fighting on all fronts is about solidarity. So I'm going to switch back to the smaller beret, to the lighter beret. Since it is a summer night here. Okay, so thank you, Laura. They are wonderful indeed.
Yes. Thank you. We have so much fun indeed wearing these.
Laura says, yes, love that show. The red thread. Hashtag FOAF. Also, everyone see healthcare.movie. And Lana says, hi, everyone. Nice to see Bonnie. Okay, and also the Laura says, hi, Laura. So we will also take some pictures. And Russ says, Devora looks a lot like Bonnie. Ah.
No.
Well, thank you. I think that's a compliment.
Thank you.
Okay. And Laura says, you're both so welcome. So thank you again, Laura. They were worth waiting for. Boy, they are terrific.
Boy, did we have fun opening these up and getting them on. Pulling it down over his nose or something. We had a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we're still having a wonderful time, as you can tell. Okay, so I do have an announcement before I proceed to the business of the day. And Carmen says, Bonnie looks so young, as do you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we both appreciate that since we are as old as the hills.
Yeah, and we're hoping to live to be 125.
Yes, we have made ourselves a promise. We will live until we're 125.
We'll sit on the couch.
Because we enjoy life so much. So let me reorient the camera here a little bit, or a lot, okay, as the case may be. And I have an announcement. And that announcement was, I've been trying for a few days to get a hold of Dan Kaplowitz, who is running for governor in California in the recall election. He's been advocating for voting no on the recall, but in case the recall slips through, he's also declared his candidacy for the governor if it turns out that that Newsom gets tossed out. So of course, I've been wanting to talk to him. I've tried contacting him for a few days, and about 8 or so tonight, I saw that he had messaged me on Facebook. He sent me something at 6:41. I didn't get it until very close to 8 o'clock. And we messaged each other for a while. And the result was that he's agreed to a conversation, okay, at 9 o'clock on this Monday. So I am having a special stream on Monday because, as you know, I do not usually stream, okay, on Mondays, so that we can accommodate Dan as early as possible because there's only 2 weeks until the election. Oh, that's okay, Laura. We will take some pictures of it and we will send you the images. So that will be all right. It's still going to work out fine. You don't need to take a screenshot. It's okay. So, and Evelyn says, have to say Bonnie wears it more stylishly. I would agree. I would certainly agree. We'll share the photos later, yes. And so Carmen says, hi, Lana, glad you make it. And Elvira Mahalko says, so do Californians get to pick a third choice after a second choice after they answer no on the first question? Yeah, you get a choice of all the candidates running on the second question. Oh, Evelina says, I'm looking dapper, thank you. I have to say, from what I see of all the candidates, the only candidate who might be truly qualified to serve as governor, okay, of California, okay, and not to ruin the state is probably Dan Kaplovitz. He's a lawyer with a degree, okay, from UCLA. He's Green Party. He adheres primarily to the Green Party platform. He's an animal rights lawyer. He's also a corporate lawyer. He appears to be very bright and very capable. And he appears, in general, to be qualified, okay, to be governor. Now, there it says, what about Joe Ventresca? Well, I don't know. You'll have to explain to me what Joe Ventresca is for. Or perhaps it's Joel. I can't tell with my beret on. Yeah, Joel Ventresca. Okay. Is Joel Ventresca for Medicare for All? Is Joel Ventresca for a Green New Deal? Is Joel Ventresca for student debt elimination and paid family leave? I don't think so. But I think that Dan Kaplovitz is. So I'm very happy to get a chance to interview him. Okay. I hope, Laura, we can get some help in spreading his name around on Twitter and get him trending on Twitter. If we like what he has to say on Monday, because I think this is extremely important. We got to box out by Larry Elder for sure. And just in case Californians Still want to get rid, of Newsom, whom I have really nothing good to say about, except that he's not Larry Elder. It would be a real fail-safe to have Dan in there. So Lana says, "Hi, Carmen. I am sitting close to donate. Getting ready to move. Greetings." And Lana says, "Great news, Redan." Okay, so let's get to the business of today, which is some MMT news for a Saturday night. This is a very happy Saturday night. I can't get over these berets. They're really a gas. So, okay, you'll recall last week that I shared a piece by Stephanie Kelton, and I discussed it. And the title of it was what every American needs to know about the congressional pay-for game. Is that the exact title? I think it was. About the congressional pay-for, quote-unquote, game. And that was part one. I'm not going to go through the whole of part one again because we did that. But I just want to end here with the closing of part one, and I'll move on to part two. Stephanie says, "For example, in my book, I wrote about a passing remark from Senator Barbara Boxer, Democrat of California. She of the famous chair throwing incident or something. I was seated on a staff bench in the rear of the Senate chamber. Senator Boxer had just voted in favor of a, quote, deficit but neutral, quote, but deficit but neutral amendment during a special session known as a votorama. It was, of course, the reconciliation bill. As she walked past the senator who authored the amendment, she quipped, quote, I voted for your amendment even though your pay for is bullshit, unquote. That's what little Barbara Boxer had to say as she walked by, betraying her origins in New York City. As I wrote in the book, I couldn't have said it better myself. Her point was a simple one. This is Stephanie now. We've got a really screwy way of drafting, evaluating, and passing the legislation. We pretend the federal government needs to budget like a household. We think of taxes as something the government needs, i.e. revenue, instead of remembering the taxes are there to subtract spending power from the rest of us so that the government's own spending doesn't push the economy beyond its full employment limit. We hamstring legislation by demanding that the government, quote, pay for, unquote, new spending, even when the economy could safely absorb that spending without the need for higher taxes. And we do all of this because we've decided that these household budgeting practices somehow serve the public interest. They don't, unquote. The public needs to understand that this whole, quote, pay for game, unquote, is really about and why, despite appearances, it doesn't actually result in responsible budgeting practices. There's a lot at stake, $3.5 trillion to be exact. That's money for health care, child care, elder care, education, climate, and more. It's within reach, but it will take all 50 Senate Democrats to put another runner on base. Stephanie is using the baseball analogy here. Once that happens, House Democrats can wave both runners home. If that is the two bills, the $3.5 trillion bill and the infrastructure bill, the $1.2 trillion bill. If the votes are there, the money will go out just as it did during the year-long rain delay that batted approximately $5 trillion into the economy without pay-for-us, folks, without pay-for-us. The votes authorize the spending. I would say the votes appropriate the spending. They do authorize it also, but in addition, they appropriate it, and the appropriation is what mandates the spending. The votes are the real pay-fors. Everything else is political theater, masquerading as sound, but finance. That statement is, of course, strictly correct. Now, I want to move to part two, because yesterday, I believe it was, Stephanie came forth with part two. And there is going to be a part three also. So part two is not going to end this. We're also going to be treated to a part three as well. So here we are. What every American needs to know about the congressional pay-for game, part two. Why it's a swing and a miss for me. Actually, evidently, Stephanie released this on August 24th. Last week, I wrote about America's favorite pastime, baseball, of course. She'd probably get an argument about that today. Not when I was a kid, though. Baseball, of course. The purpose of the post was to expose congressional, quote, pay-for game for what it really is, political theater masquerading as sound finance. I've been writing and speaking out about this for more than 2 decades. By the way, I've been writing and speaking out about this for about 12 years myself. And it looks like the message is finally beginning to break through, but we have a long way to go. And this section is entitled, "The Rich Will, quote, pay for, unquote, it." By now, everyone knows that the Senate passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill that is working on a so-called, quote, unquote, soft infrastructure package that could result in the passage of a $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill in the coming months. My previous post explained how the bipartisan deal was accomplished by calling the rain delay, quote unquote, on the whole, quote, pay for, unquote, game. Now, everyone is watching to see whether and how the next package will be, quote, paid for, unquote, paid for. Within the halls of Congress, this is mostly a numbers on paper game. Outside the Beltway, it's more about messaging those numbers. Think, quote, how, unquote, versus, quote, who, unquote. Quote, how will you pay for it, unquote, is the numbers game. This is where lawmakers try to stitch up the legislation so that they come as close as possible on paper to being able to claim that they're not adding to the deficit so the spending is paid for. Almost no one on the outside cares how Congress finesses the numbers to play the, quote, pay for, unquote, game. What most people care about is what it means for them. Quote, who will pay for it, unquote, is the bigger concern for most Americans. Democrats have settled on an answer to that question. The rich will pay for it. Following the Biden administration's lead, Democrats are working to craft legislation that they can message as, quote, fiscally responsible, unquote, while allowing the president to keep his promise to the American people. So here's what I do. I start with one rule. No one, let me say it again, no one making under $400,000 will see their federal taxes go up. period, unquote. The man who will ultimately stitch up the numbers on the reconciliation package is Senate Budget Committee Chairman Bernie Sanders, Independent Decay of Vermont. Which, by the way, probably means that the man who will ultimately stitch up the numbers on the reconciliation package is going to be the man with the receipts, Warren Gunnels. But this is not, of course, in Stephanie's post. In addition to using the media and the press to build support for the $3.5 trillion package, Sanders, a tireless crusader for the working class and against the billionaire class, quote unquote, has taken his case directly to the people of Indiana and Iowa. And I don't know if he's still there tonight, but as of yesterday, he was still there. The message is simple. It's time for large, profitable corporations and the richest people in America to pay higher taxes so that everyone else can have a better life. Many of the lawmakers I've talked with over the years like this messaging. It's easy to see why. It's compact enough to fit in a TV soundbite, and it answers the inevitable, quote, how will you pay for it, unquote, question in a way that appears both fiscally responsible and morally righteous. Those who have avoided paying their, quote, fair share, unquote, of taxes should pony up for the sake of the greater good. It's messaging that resonates with most of the progressive members of Congress. Yes, I wrote a book about that. I called it The Progressive Give Up Formula is Alive and Well. It's real fiscal responsibility, the progressive give up formula in Congress is alive and well. Anyway, Stephanie goes on. It's messaging that resonates with the most progressive members of Congress. For example, here's a tweet from Congressman Pramila Jayapal of the Washington 7th, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And here is Jayapal's tweet. We can afford child care, paid leave, free community college, expansion of Medicare, the PRO Act, climate action, and much more. How? By making billionaires and corporations finally pay their fair share. Let's pass our jobs and families' bill and make it happen. That's a pretty simple pitch. Let's build a better society and get the rich to pay for it. This newsletter is called The Lens for a reason. My research and policy analysis is grounded in a macro framework known as MMT, or modern monetary theory. MMT is the lens through which I analyze the macroeconomy and evaluate economic policy. Please bear that in mind as you read on. Our next section is called the two-itch problem. That is, two and itch are in quotes. So what happens when we look at the, quote, pay for, unquote, debate through an MMT lens? Peering through the MMT lens, this is my MMT lens, we understand that the federal government, as the issuer of the currency, never needs to raise taxes or borrow from anyone in order to finance its spending. Moreover, the money we send to the IRS in payment of taxes each year isn't actually used to pay for anything. And there's footnote 1 there, which is to a Substack, okay, of Stephanie's. But it might as well have been to Stephanie's classic paper on this subject. That was published, the first version was published in 1998, I believe, and a later version was published in a referee journal in the year 2000. It was entitled, Can Taxes and Bonds, if I recall correctly, Finance Federal Spending? Stephanie's answer to that question was no. And the reason why it was no is outlined in that pretty rigorous paper. There's a looser answer given right here. It's true that there is a ledger entry to account for the funds the Treasury collects over time. But the federal government isn't actually using, quote, taxpayer dollars, unquote, to pay for anything. That is, at the federal level, taxpayer dollars are not a thing. They are not a thing. Think about it like this. Delta Airlines issues hashtag SkyMiles, which can be redeemed for air travel by returning them to their issuer. Each day, Delta redeems a lot of SkyMiles, and throughout the year, Delta awards SkyMiles to millions of people. These things happen independent of one another. To issue SkyMiles, more points get typed into a SkyMiles account. I should be adding hashtag. Each time I said SkyMiles, I should have said hashtag SkyMiles. To redeem hashtag SkyMiles, points are deleted from a passenger's account. Delta doesn't hold any hashtag SkyMiles in a vault, and it doesn't use the old miles to issue new ones. It's just a ledger system where the issuer keeps one set of entries to keep track of how many new miles are issued, and another to record how many old miles are redeemed. The same thing happens when the federal government spends and redeems its currency in payment of taxes. The US dollar functions as a tax credit. See here for further reading. That's a New York Times article. I don't know at this point whether it was written by Stephanie or not. It may have been. But that's not what the pay-for proponents would have us believe. What we're hearing is that Democrats are going to tax the rich and use the money to pay for more resilient infrastructure, more affordable housing, better health care, some free college, and much more. Instead of trickle down, think shifting down. By shifting money out of the bank accounts of the fat cats on top and into the bank accounts of those below, Democrats promise a world in which we can afford to feed a hungry kid, expand Medicare, and tackle our climate crisis. For some Democrats, this looks like a win-win. They get to scratch 2 inches at once, soak the rich, and build an economy that works for the working class. Robin Hood to the rescue. See? 2 inches on that cartoon? So what's wrong with that? What am I? Some kind of stalking horse for the rich? Shilling MMT to protect the fat cats from higher taxes? Hardly. And then she links to a piece, actually an interview she had with Anand Giridharadas. And maybe if we have time, we will go into that interview, a little later, because it's quite interesting. And it's entitled, The $1 Trillion Woman. Anyway, I do have a number of problems with the pay-for game and how it's being played, but not because I'm opposed to taxing the rich. My keynote at the inaugural conference of the Patriotic Millionaires makes that clear at 2 hours, 22 minutes, and 30 seconds. But because I filter everything through an MMT lens, here's what I see as the most problematic aspects of the pay-for game, quote unquote. 1, it perpetuates the household budgeting fallacy. It makes it harder to do things. It centers the rich in our collective well-being. It ignores inflation risk. First and fundamental to MMT, the federal government is the issuer of the currency, and the rest of us are mere mortal currency users. Oh, and by the way, the very first presentation I saw from Stephanie on April 28th of 2010 was about the distinction between currency issuers, and currency users. And when I saw that, I knew I was watching the real thing someone who could give you some complex economics in a crystal clear fashion. That presentation was crystalline, as this blog post is. Government budgets don't work like household budgets. Mapping out a plan to scrape together the revenue to, quote, pay for, unquote, the reconciliation package reinforces a flawed household budgeting narrative. Here I am with Warren Mosler explaining this almost a decade ago. Yes, this was at Columbia University, if I recall correctly, where they were giving an MMT presentation. And this was in the second of a series that was held at Columbia by the Modern Money Network. And the name of it was was Governments Are Not Households. The series was Modern Money and Public Purpose. This was the second episode in that series. Second, if Democrats dig in and commit to fully, quote, paying for, unquote, the reconciliation package, they'll have to pick and win two fights within their own caucus. Not only will they need to hold the entire caucus together around the $3.5 trillion itself, but they'll need unanimous support for the slew of, quote, pay-fors, unquote, to keep it all deficit neutral. If we're being honest, there just isn't a hearty, party-wide appetite for a wealth tax. Raising the corporate income tax rate to 28% or taxing capital gains as ordinary income. Even allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices might prove too heavy a lift for certain Democrats. If that's the case, then Democrats will have to decide whether they're willing to do, quote, soft, unquote, infrastructure the same way the Senate agreed to do, quote, hard, unquote, infrastructure earlier this month, namely by shrugging off the pay-fors and allowing some of the spending to fall onto the deficit. I'm all for watching lawmakers work to make the tax code more fair, but I'd hate to see the Democrats start paring back a spending package to fit whatever price tag they consider affordable, given the, quote, revenue, unquote, they think they have to work with. Third, and this relates to number two, I have a big problem with centering the rich in this way. And here's a tweet from Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren. And it says, America's billionaires have done great during this pandemic. But America's working families, not so much. It's time for a hashtag wealth tax on the ultra-rich to raise the revenue needed to invest in childcare, expand healthcare coverage, and fight back against climate change. Instead of just building a clean case for a wealth tax, it gets stitched up with the proposed spending so that the means justify the ends. So it becomes an if-then problem. If we can successfully wrest a few trillion from the fat cats at the top of the income distribution, then we can scatter some support down to the rest of our people and our planet. If we can't get 50 votes to raise trillions to offset the spending, then I guess it's tough luck for all those people who were just lifted out of poverty with the stroke of a deficit spending pen. No food or shelter for the poor, no care for the elderly, and no action on the climate front. We can't do it without the rich. They are our, quote, pay-fors, unquote. We need them. Here's how I put it when Anand Giridharadas asked me whether I consider this messaging a problem. And then she quotes again from the deficit myth. In addition, I'm sorry, she's quoting now from the answer to Anand. Quote, in addition to getting the economics wrong, I believe it is politically harmful to pretend that we cannot afford to fix our crumbling infrastructure or care for our people unless until we successfully wrest part of Jeff Bezos' fortune away from him. Here's how I put it in the deficit myth. The crime of the tax bill signed by President Trump in 2017 is not that it added to the deficit, but that it used the deficit to provide help to those who needed it least. It has widened inequality, putting more political and economic power into the hands of the few. MMT understands that building a better economy isn't contingent on raising enough revenue to pay for the things we want. We can and must tax the rich, but not because we can't afford to do anything without them. We should tax billionaires to rebalance the distribution of wealth and income and to protect the health of our democracy. But we don't need to crack open their piggy banks to eradicate poverty or to have the federal job guarantee with a living wage that Coretta Scott King fought for. We already have the tools we need. Feigning dependence on those with incredible wealth sends the wrong message, making them appear more vital to our cause than they actually are. Finally, it must be recognized that because of the way the pay-for game is being played, Democrats are signaling that they're more focused on keeping the deficit in check than keeping a watchful eye on inflation. It's an unpopular observation, so I'll let my friend Dean Baker make it. Oh, to laugh out loud. And she quotes Dean Baker. Okay, but those points aside, how should we think about proposals to tax the rich from an MMT perspective? First, we know we can raise more money by taxing the rich. So if the point is to raise revenue, that is where the money is. But we know the point of taxes is not actually to raise revenue. The point is to reduce consumption and decrease demand in the economy. Here's where the story looks less good. Suppose we tax away 70% of the income over $10 million a year of our Silicon Valley billionaires and Wall Street high flyers instead of the current 37%. Do we think this additional tax bill will reduce the number of times Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos goes out to dinner? Will they take fewer vacations or buy fewer cars, planes, and yachts? Well, I'm sure the effect will not be zero, especially for lesser billionaires or mere 100 billionaires. Taking another $70 billion in taxes from these people will not have nearly as large an impact in reducing consumption as taking $70 billion out of the pockets of low and middle income people. This is just the flip side of the argument that if we want to stimulate the economy in a downturn, a tax cut will be far more effective if it is directed towards people at the middle and the bottom of the income distribution than people at the top. Now, Dean wrote this back in February 2019, before COVID-19 ravaged our economy. And while it remains true that the tax increases Democrats are pursuing won't do much to depress their consumption, it's also less risky to get it wrong today versus back in February 2019 when the unemployment rate was 3.8%. It's also true that many of the things Democrats are pushing for will mitigate inflationary pressures. For example, negotiating prescription drug prices is a very nice disinflationary policy. But Medicare for All would do even more to dampen healthcare costs, which is a major contributor to headline measures of inflation. Notice, a Medicare for All program would be deflationary for the federal government because it would not put more federal money into the economy, but necessarily. Building and modernizing physical infrastructure and investing in childcare, healthcare, and education also boost productivity and build capacity over time. So I'm not sounding the inflation alarm bell with respect to the $3.5 trillion. I'm just pointing out that when it comes to the pay for game, we're getting a lot of things wrong. I have more to say on this, so stay tuned for part 3. And please consider sharing and subscribing to The Lens so that we continue this journey together. So I'm sure you'll agree that was a very fine post. I'm going to read the footnotes too. They're very good. Footnote 1, taxes are important for many reasons, and bond sales serve other functions. It can take some time to wrap your head around these arguments because they run completely counter to what we have all been taught. Okay, for what it's worth, I didn't believe it myself until I spent months researching the actual mechanics of government finance. I wrote about that experience in my book. That research culminated in a peer-reviewed article, which is what eventually got me over the hump. And so here was the title. That was the article I was talking about before. And its title was, Do Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending? And Steph's answer was no. Footnote 2, self-imposed rules like the bird rule are in play. The bird rule is what governed by reconciliation, okay, what governs reconciliation. And until constraints like that one are removed, Democrats will find themselves struggling to keep the spending deficit neutral outside the 10-year budget window. Yes, they will. So there we are. That was the news from Stephanie. I'm sure you can see it's very, very well argued. It's incomplete yet because we don't have part 3. When we do have part 3, I will certainly cover it as soon as I can. Now, I see time is getting a little short, so I won't go to the Giridharadas post, but what I want to do now is present some news that was actually made, but I don't know if it was really trumpeted, by Steve Grumbine, who did a live stream on July 10th. Actually, not a live stream, it was a podcast, okay, on July 10th. And what I want to do for you is go through the transcript from the podcast. In the podcast, a Macro and Cheese podcast, Steve was interviewing none other than Randy Wray, one of the people generally acknowledged as the 3 fathers, okay, of MMT. The original synthesizer was actually Warren Mosler, and in writings following shortly thereafter, those came from Randy Wray and Bill Mitchell, the Australian professor, economics professor. They are generally recognized as the top 3, okay, in MMT. Though Stephanie has now gotten very, very close to them, certainly as a communicator, okay, of MMT, having a vast knowledge, okay, of MMT. And Stephanie followed really closely on the original developers by just a few years. She was lucky enough to study with Randy fairly early. And she kept in contact and then joined very early the developer group inside, okay, of MMT. There are many books by Randy. I have ceased to keep track of them. I have written 7 books, okay, on MMT. I suspect that Randy has more, that he may have by now 10 to 15 books. Okay, but you can see I'm not counting, or I would know how many books he actually had written. I hadn't, really bothered to count that. He's a very good writer. The primer, okay, for MMT is a book, okay, that I have and that I have read now countless times. It's been a great book for me and a great influence on me. And he is a co-author with Bill Mitchell and also a man by the name of Martin Watts of the macroeconomics textbook, which is currently the first and only MMT text. And it is basically the MMT encyclopedia. If you want to have something where you can look up a good answer to any MMT question, that's the book. It's a terrific book. I use it as an encyclopedia myself. Randy's original book was also a terrific book. So Steve starts, okay, the interview. He says to Randy, let's start with an understanding of currency issuer, currency user, and the federal government and the states. And Randy says, okay, sure. So in the United States, it's fairly obvious to everyone that it's the federal government that issues our Constitution. That is even in the Constitution that only the U.S. Congress can issue the currency. And so we say the federal government is the currency issuer. This is a plain statement of fact, and there's lots of stuff that followed from that. And that's what MMT has been focused on, the policy space that's available to the sovereign government that issues the currency. We probably don't have to go through that in detail. State and local governments are users of that currency. They don't issue a currency, and they really do need to finance their spending, either through tax revenue or through borrowing. But then Randy says, state enterprises, I suppose, are possible that generate by revenue. State enterprise, I suppose, are possible that generate revenue. I will come back to that thought as I go through this, perhaps at the end, because there's a really important point that is relevant to whole Washington in that very short statement. Randy goes on. So they really need to get the financing first before they can spend. 48 of the states have constitutional requirements to balance the budget. So when a budget is proposed, it must be balanced or run a surplus. Now that doesn't mean that they always do run surpluses. The typical case is in a deep recession. Tax revenue falls a lot. Some kinds of state spending go up automatically. Now, by the way, I should emphasize, if states do run surpluses, those surpluses are not destroyed as federal surpluses are. Those surpluses reside in state bank accounts and continue to reside in these state bank accounts. They're not destroyed in financial settlement as the Fed destroys federal tax revenues. Got to keep that in mind. If states build up surpluses over a period of time, they got those surpluses in an actual bank account. Actual bank account. Important to know. Okay, the typical case is in a deep recession, tax revenue falls a lot. Some kinds of state spending go up automatically. Yeah, because states have automatic stabilizers too. States participate in things like, for example, Medicaid and in unemployment compensation. So there's some spending that will increase. They have some discretion to cut spending, and they typically will do that when tax revenue falls. So they will lay off teachers, lay off police, and we feel the effects of that when that happens. So that's typically what happens in recession. The federal government doesn't have to do that. And in fact, when its tax revenue falls significantly in recessions, as it always does, let me put just a little footnote that I'll come back to because COVID has been different. When revenue falls, they typically increase spending on those automatic stabilizer type things, and they also discretionarily increase their spending a bit on what we call government consumption. Increase their spending a bit on what we call government consumption, stimulus packages and things like that. So they can move in the opposite direction as the currency issuer. In other words, they can move counter to the economic cycle. The economic cycle takes state revenues down, but the federal spending takes state spending down, but takes federal spending up in the opposite direction because as the currency issuer, the federal government can do that. Why? Because it always creates new money in the private sector when it spends into the private sector. Randy goes on. They don't have to worry about where the money is going to come from because it always comes from payments that are made on behalf of the Treasury by the Fed. Okay, do you have that? That's a very important factual point in modern money theory. When the federal government spends into the economy, the money always comes from payments made on behalf of the Treasury by the Federal Reserve, which is the Treasury's bank. So that's what MMT has been demonstrating for 25 years, says Randy. As Warren always says, he's referring to Warren Mosler here, we're yet to have any legitimate criticism of our descriptions. There are no flaws in that description. So anyway, when we look at the difference between the two, that is the state and the federal government, it's pretty stark. The things that are often said about the federal government, quote, oh, you got to run the federal government just it was like a household or a firm, quote, unquote, are completely false. But if you apply those to state government, it's not nearly so false. Now, I want to focus on that last statement. But if you apply those to state and local governments, it's not nearly so false. Okay, in other words, it's somewhere between false, and true. Maybe you don't got to run the state government quite like it was a household or a firm. Because the opposite is not completely but false. They do have to try to balance their budgets, both because of the constitutional requirements they've imposed on themselves, but also because markets do react. When deficits are incurred, states get downgraded. Downgraded by who? The credit agencies. City governments get downgraded. Downgraded by Wall Street, downgraded by the banks. They can default on their debt, and there have been cases of them defaulting. Orange County is a very famous case, one of the richest parts of the whole country. Got to point out here, Orange County is not a state. The whole state of California did not default because Orange County defaulted. The county defaulted on its debt, and there were real consequences of that downsizing, education, and cuts in policing, and so on. But the point that I want to make here, commenting on this passage, is that it was not the state that actually defaulted. In theory, states could default, but if there was a case where a state had defaulted on its debts, surely Randy would have mentioned it here. Instead, his example is of a county which has defaulted on its debt. Anyway, going on. When the euro was formed way back in the 90s, as we were developing MMT, we applied our kind of analysis to the formerly sovereign countries of Italy and Greece and France and Spain and Portugal. Well, they're still sovereign now. I think what he meant was the formerly monetary sovereign countries of Italy and Greece and France and Spain and Portugal. Because now they are no longer monetarily sovereign. But strictly speaking, they are still sovereign. And said that the problem with the setup was that those countries no longer were currency issuers. They were currency users. The ECB, or the European Central Bank, was the issuer. And it was prohibited from doing the kinds of things the Fed does for the U.S. Treasury. I think what he's saying there is there's no real European central government. There's a European Central Bank, which is like the Fed. But they can't do the kinds of things for the state governments, or the analog to state governments, specifically France and Germany, okay, and Italy, the sovereign countries, okay, of the Eurozone. They can't do the same kinds of things for them that the Fed does before the U.S. Treasury. But to be completely clear about this analogy, our Fed is apparently not able to do the same kinds of things for our state governments that it does for the U.S. Treasury. So in making that comparison, we have to be clear that this is also true. Anyway, Randy goes on. So they became more like U.S. states. And so we analyze them as sort of this strange new invention that was trying to tie the purse strings of these formerly sovereign nations by making them more like U.S. states. And we said it's going to end up in a disaster. And it did end up in a disaster. There are some differences. I don't want to say it's a perfect, I don't want to say it's a perfect analogy to say that Greece is just like Louisiana, but there are similarities and there are problems of that. I think he meant to say problems like that, but that's all right. So then Steve comes in. That was fantastic. I am of great concern. We've talked at length about MMT for years now. You've been on the show with me. You've been on other shows with me. I've watched you many, many times. Your writings have directly impacted my understanding of MMT. In fact, I've been on record many times saying you're probably the most influential of the MMT developers in terms of my understanding. And I guess the question I have is, given the extreme nature of the things that are impacting both the climate right now and the healthcare in America, which is absolutely an embarrassment, it's horrific. We should be thinking how to solve more than one problem at one time, because we've got problems that are not actually negotiating with one another. They're kind of coming together in a perfect storm with the climate situation. We got the Arctic burning up. It was 118 degrees. We got those zombie fires beneath the frost in the marsh. We got all kinds of heat waves going through the Pacific Northwest. I believe it was 109 degrees in Seattle. I think it was 116 degrees in Portland, Oregon. So we've got, and he forgot to mention in Vancouver, was it 121 degrees in Vancouver or something like that? I think it was 116 in Portland, Oregon. So we've got an existential climate crisis going on as well right now, coupled with a failed healthcare system and a failed education system and a failed marketplace for public option for jobs. We have a lot going on that has to be done right now. Probably piecemeal probably isn't going to get it done. And yet the only person I've heard in Congress really take a bold stand was John Yarmouth. We had celebrated AOC tipping her pinky toe into the water. But watching John Yarmouth the other day speak, we played a clip with Warren Mosler on our podcast. But I think everybody's had a chance to hear that. And if they haven't, I suggest going to C-SPAN and checking it out. But it's obvious that Congress is getting clued in. the work that Stephanie has done with the deficit myth and all the work that you all have done in helping people like myself get the word out at an activist level and all the stuff you've done in Congress. What is the temperature like for the federal government right now? Question mark. Are we starting to see a thawing there where they're starting to realize, hey, maybe we ought to do something? And Randy then goes and he says, but Yarmouth invited me to the budget committee and I gave a talk and I talked to him beforehand and I was surprised because what they really wanted him to talk about was MMT. And they said, this is what Yarmouth wants. And he said, we're all talking about this, and the Democratic side is pretty much on board. They really do want to hear the explanation. And I got a bit of warning just before I went to Washington. The right-wing think tank had prepared the talking points for the Republicans. And so if anyone's watched that video, you'll see they're like zombies. They've been programmed to just repeat those talking points. That's all they did. Now, the Democratic side, so I was assured that they were on board, and I think that Yarmouth's interview recently demonstrates just how on board they are. This is not just him. I know he was only speaking for himself, but I think the others on the budget committee, the other Democrats, share many of those same views. So the tide has turned. And Steve said, that's huge. That's huge. And I agree. If that's true, that is huge that all the Democrats on the committee understood enough about MMT to think that some of the core MMT propositions are those they can act upon. Randy then says, there's still, of course, our politics. There's still hesitation about what can be said in public because you've got to run again, and whatever you say will be used against you by the Republicans using the usual scare tactics. So I'm not saying it was going to come out and be as forthright as him. People in safe districts, I guess, could do that. But, they've got to be careful about what they say and how they vote and so on. I understand all that. But just as far as the message getting through, it has gotten through. And I think that also explains why we were able to have $5 trillion through in various relief packages. Some people call it stimulus, but there was no stimulus. It was really without talking about pay-fors. But as we see, pay-for is being used by both sides, actually, in the next $4 trillion. So the ideas are there. The politics is still difficult. We're not home free. And as you said, we face multiple pandemics, and they are all linked. The person who I think got that earliest, well, at least the person I'm aware of and who wrote about it very clearly, demonstrated all these things were linked, was Naomi Klein, the shock doctrine, right? So we have a pandemic of racism, climate catastrophe, and COVID. We have a pandemic of inequality unlike this country has ever seen before, driven home by ProPublica's piece on tax avoidance, a pandemic of fires, pandemic of heat, pandemic of oceans rising, which then leads to a pandemic, of refugees. All of these things are linked, and so you're absolutely right. They all have to be tackled simultaneously. We can't tackle racism without tackling the health pandemic, that we have the unequal access to health care. The COVID impacts people of color much more greatly than college-educated white people, for example, who have much better access to health care and also better access to good information. So we have to do a lot of those things. The private sector, which is for profit, can't do this, first because a lot of it would not be profitable for them, but second because it requires coordination. Not just national coordination, it requires international coordination. It does no good to wipe out or almost wipe out COVID in the United States alone because it's a health problem that easily spreads and will reappear again in a more virulent form. It has to be tackled globally. Climate change. It does no good to green the U.S. economy if we don't green the rest of the world. So anyway, we have to tackle all of them. Private sector cannot do this. They can play some role in it, but it has to be government. And for the reasons we just went through, it has to be the currency issuer, and it has to be the biggest, most powerful, richest countries that do most of the work because they can mobilize the resources. They are the source of most of the problems. So it is right that they do it They have the resource and financial capacity to do it. So we have to return to an economic system that recognizes that you need a big government that is the currency issuer. And I think the days of neoliberalism are over. The argument that the government is the problem, not the solution, is over. Then he says something about COVID and the incapacity of leadership in the U.S. and Brazil, okay, the UK, okay, and India. And he talks again about a big government with good leadership in order to tackle these problems. So Steve then goes into what two climate scientists have to say and how terrible the situation is. And he says, and this to me should take a debate out of the debate. It should put us into mobilization, organizing and activating our nation at the grand central government level to push this. I know there is a great desire for local and state direct local action. That's very noble, and we need that. We need everybody, all hands on deck. But it's quite clear that, to your point, it has to be a global effort because this marble keeps turning, and what impacts one area will have impacts across the globe. So with that in mind, we have to talk about this in other venues. I want to be crystal clear. My intention is not to sabotage anyone's activism, that we have people pushing for state-based health care. And I've even seen folks pushing for reparations that are state-based. We've watched people try to push for a local Green New Deal. These are things that are born in a good heart but have disastrous consequences. I was looking at the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, for the various states across the U.S., and a vast majority of them are not in great shape. Their reserves are quite low, and their ability to absorb any real shock is very limited. I'm curious, what would be your message to considering the idea of state-based Medicare for all and the viability of such a proposal? Steve finally gets to the point, right? Well, I think the usefulness of state initiatives, and cities also have initiatives, is a demonstration. So I'm a native Californian, and Californian also had either the toughest or among the most tough environmental, especially air quality requirements. So I can remember when California got the lead out of gasoline and required much better emission systems on cars, and gradually those things were adopted by the EPA. So it's very valuable, and you know this is what activists do. Activists in California pushed this, and we got it in California. Then eventually the U.S. gets on board, and that was back when the federal government wasn't that bad. But you compare it to the federal government that we've had since the days of Ronald Reagan, at least it's much harder to get them to do things like that. So you can see why activists have sort of given up on the federal government. It's just too hard, even though the Democrats did okay, I guess, in the last election. It's still 50-50. So they have to go to all sorts of extremes to try to get anything through. So it's completely understandable that activists in more progressive states think they've got to go it alone, and it would be useful as a demonstration project that might then spread and might eventually go to the federal level. I think there are a couple of objections, says Randy. So one is maybe things are changing at the federal level. So that's what we were just talking about. I think we should not be giving up a broad-based Green New Deal that includes Medicare for all, which was the Bernie proposal, AOC proposal. We shouldn't give up. And Yarmouth in his talk said, look, we're going to submit everything we possibly can to the vote. But the vote is not going to constrain us. We're going to go to reconciliation, and we're going to get the rest of the package. That's what he said. He's very optimistic. Now, maybe he's a little too optimistic. I don't know, but he's the politician, but not me. So, Randy said there that for states to go for something like a Medicare for All program as sort of a demonstration project, that might be useful. But he also says we should not be giving up, on a national level, because more possibilities are now open because people are getting familiar with the possibilities MMT holds out. And this makes them more willing to go for big projects, and for big things. But it's important, that Randy does not exclude the idea of demonstration projects at the state level, even though, of course, he's very focused on the kinds of problems that can happen at the state level. So his first objection is, don't give up too quickly on the federal level. But we can do demonstration projects. So the objection is, don't give up on the federal level. However, Red Berets are not giving up on the federal level. We're doing both the federal level and the demonstration projects. And Randy doesn't say not to do that here, does he? Steve comes back and says, right. Laughs and says, right. Wray says, so I presume he has a pretty good idea of how this is going to progress, so we should not be given up. The second reason is that the states are current users. They really do have to balance their budget. And I said, that's what happens in recessions as tax revenue plummets. They use up their rainy day funds, and they have to start cutting spending. And they have to prioritize what they can spend on. The thing about Medicare for All is this is open-ended spending. A job guarantee is also open-ended spending. Unemployment compensation is open-ended. That is, if someone meets the requirements, then you have to spend. And in bad times, typically the number of people who meet the requirements is going to go up. So people get laid off from their private sector jobs. Sorry, I need some tea there. And they need unemployment compensation. They need housing assistance. They're going to go off their employer-provided private health insurance. So more are going to flow into the Medicare for All program and unemployment compensation, into whatever kinds of housing programs the states have. So just at the time the states are losing tax revenue, the spending will go up. So they're going to face problems. I said I would give a footnote on the pandemic because this time around the federal government provided $5 trillion in relief. And states got through this recession, which if you just look at the aggregate numbers, this recession would look like the worst we ever had since the Great Depression. That should have just absolutely devastated state and local government budgets, but it didn't. Now they're impacted. I'm not trying to say, nothing bad happened. But considering how many people lost their jobs, how many businesses shut their doors, as many are temporary, we hope, but how many had to shut down? This should have been an absolute disaster for state governments, but the federal government gave income to households and had a wide variety of ways to support business and also provide funding to state and local governments. So what this says is state and local governments will worsen tremendously unless the federal government steps in, which they did. So that brings up another issue, which is that back during the Nixon years, I'm not sure that Nixon created these block grants, but he increased the amount. I can remember this. Unlike you, I wasn't a kid, but I don't remember details, all the details. Okay, so I remember some of the details. I'm not sure that Nixon created the block grants either, but I know that he used an awful lot of block grants back then to give funding to states, and that Carter followed through, even increasing the funding to states. Category grants and block grants for particular purposes. In fact, during those periods, I worked on formula funding, on actually developing formulas for the Census Bureau and for the Department of Agriculture in order to determine what money states were going to be getting under these block grants. So Nixon provided the block grants to the states, and those were bad times. In the early 70s, we had 2 recessions in a row, our first significant one since the Great Depression. And Nixon provided block grants that allowed states to spend more than they could spend out of their tax revenue and borrowing. So that, plus what we just did this time around, shows how you could implement programs at state and local government levels with supplemental funding from the federal government that could protect them against the cyclical movements of their tax revenue. So that goes part of the way towards solving the problem. Okay, part of the way towards solving the problem, that is solving his objections, that the federal government can protect the states. They have in the past. They did so in COVID. And of course, perhaps they can do so again. Now, when I first heard about the conflict between the Red Berets and the RP people, first thing I thought about was the possibility of category grants and block grants. That was the first thing that came to my mind, too. That in case of trouble, the federal government can bail out the states. And if they, on a regular basis, provide category grants, and block grants, then the state-level programs, state-level single-payer programs, would be much more sustainable, as Randy says here. And so that goes part of the way towards solving the problem. Okay, but then Randy says, but then the third objection to having state and local governments do it is we're all supposed to be Americans and we should all have access to the same good things. And why should it be because I happen to live in Mississippi that I can't get Medicare for all because my state is run by racist politicians who don't want health care to be provided to all residents of their states. And so right now, they're turning down Medicaid. And Steve says, it's preposterous. Randy says, I don't want to say it's Mississippi because I haven't seen the list, but it's a very large number of the Republican-run states that are turning down funding the federal government wants to supply them to give health care to low-income people in their states. That just tells you how far they will go to make sure that people of color in their states won't have adequate coverage of health care. Maybe this is the biggest objection to doing it that way. Why should California have much cleaner running cars? I can remember when LA was similar to Beijing occasionally is now. And so can I remember that. But the point here is that this objection, of Randy's is, yes, it's not fair for Mississippi but not to have the same kinds of programs that California has or that Washington has or that other blue states has. It's not fair that Alabama is run by Republican governors who won't get their share, of state aid. That is all not fair, and that all suggests that it's better to have a national program. But nobody, and especially not the Red Berets, are arguing that we shouldn't have a national program. We are arguing that we should have a national program, but since nothing's going on at the national level because of the opposition of Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and the leadership of the House and the Senate, and some key senators and some key House people in both places, since they seem unalterably opposed to Medicare for all, at least for the time being, it looks like it isn't possible to get it through at the national level, or at least it's very, very unlikely that it will get through at the national level. And as whole Washington people and Red Berets people are fond of saying, it looks like there's a pretty good chance to get it through in certain states, much better chance in those states than in certain states, than it may be at the federal level. For example, Governor Cuomo is gone. So the chances are much better in New York for passage of the New York Health Act, a single-payer act for New York. In California, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the governor to pass California single-payer if Newsom survives the recall. And if he intends to go on to higher office, or if he intends to run again for the governorship, he's going to have to explain to people why he hasn't already passed single payer, which running last time he guaranteed to them. There's going to be a lot of pressure. So it looks like it might have a much better chance in California. And of course, in Washington, we know it has a pretty good chance, okay, in Washington, due to the efforts of whole Washington in the past. So that's at least 3 states, But there are substantial single-payer movements in many other states, okay, as well. There's the onepayerstates.org website, which tells you about all the various states that have single-payer movements, okay, that are going on, and they're in touch with whole Washington. The week after next week, in fact, the Tuesday after next week, but Georgia Davenport will be coming on the program, and she has a lot of knowledge of the state of politics in the various states of the union with respect to their getting single payer, because she has been active at the onepayerstates.org site. So we're going to learn more about that situation from her. But the important thing to point out here is that will be the situation in some states that the way to getting single payer will not be blocked in those states. And surely no one in good faith could make the argument that we shouldn't go ahead and get single payer in those states just because the Republican governors won't take federal aid, okay, that is offered to them, or just because the Republican governors are totally opposed to single payer. Why should that affect whether single payer gets passed in states where the population wants single payer health care in the worst way? I mean, what kind of politics is it to say those states should not have it? I know the argument. Well, if they had it, they'll have less of incentive to support a national single payer program. And that may be true for some people. It's not true, I'm sure, for certain other people, okay, like for Red Berets, okay, it is certainly not true. But what they also fail to take into account is that pressure will build up on senators in the have-not states to get their people whatever they can in the way of single payer. They'll look to other states. They'll be envious of single payer states. They'll begin to move into the single payer states, and the senators of the states that don't have single payer will eventually cave, and they will move over to NEMA, National Improved Medicare for All. That is what is likely to happen. Anyway, going on with this, and perhaps a little faster because we're a little behind. So they go on with more talking. If I'm living in Mississippi or Alabama, I'm needing health care. In my state, I'm screwed. Are we going to be asking for people to check their papers as they cross the state border? As of now, there's studies out there that show people going on vacation to Europe. This is what Steve is saying. They go into Mexico to get treatment. We joke about it, but what would stop an influx of the most vulnerable people moving in and trying to get this because they're desperate? So Randy says, and I thought his answer was very interesting, yes, that is the result you would hope. So if California has cleaner air and Medicare for all and a job guarantee, you would hope that all the low-income, discriminated against people all over the country would move to California. That would be a solution. Then they would get the universal coverage and let the other states just dry up. Everybody moves out. That would be a good solution, I think. You vote with your feet. But you say, I'm not going to live in a state. So Randy is saying, go and vote with your feet. But that would be a solution. He's not saying there's going to be a race to the bottom. He's not saying there's going to be a race to the bottom. What Randy is saying is that there's going to be pressure for a race to the top because people are going to vote with their feet, and some of these other states are going to start losing population that they don't want to lose. But then Steve comes back and he says, but what about the revenue, though? That's what I'm concerned with. The revenue, the poverty going into the state and burden that would put on the state that doesn't have the ability to generate its own currency. That's my concern. And Randy said, okay, I know. And that's why states do enact residency requirements and a 6-month residency before you get access and so on, which you can understand why they do it, but I'm just talking about sort of the utopian vision. So Steve says, I get it, I'm just being silly. Well, I'm not quite sure how Steve Grumbine meant that. And Randy says, all the red states, they can go ahead and they can have their crazy right-wing politicians and no population because everyone votes to leave. I would see that as a good result. Yes, I know. But realistically, first, you can't house 350 million people in California. I got to tell you, Randy, it's only about 333 million people right now. There would be serious environmental consequences of trying to do that and so on. And then, yes, the revenue will be the great fear, so there will be attempts to try to limit who has access to that. And so then you have what we already have in the United States, a problem, of nativism. You're going to have a very narrow view of who is the nation. You have to be second or third generation Californian to get access to the good things. So yes, that creates a lot of problems too. So I was sort of joking a bit. But obviously, the best solution is to have it as a national policy. The federal government can afford this. The question is resources. But any careful analysis shows that going to Medicare for all is going to reduce the number of resources we need to devote to health care. Evan Nersessian and I did a Green New Deal paper for the Levy Institute. And so, actually, it's the Levy Institute. And so, just to be really, really safe, we said it would save something like 3.5% of the resources we already use. But you could make the argument that the U.S. is approaching 20% of all GDP is devoted to healthcare. The next closest nation is about 10%. How many times have I made that argument with you folks? An argument very like that. I've never quite said 10% before. I usually say as good as Canada, which is 11% of GDP. And they have much better outcomes than we do. So typically, the European countries, Canada, Japan, is significantly below 10%, with much better outcomes than we do. So you can make the argument that 10% should be enough, which means we have at least half of the resources we use now by moving to Medicare for all. So you're not going to be using more resources by implementing a much more efficient healthcare delivery and payment system, which is what Medicare for all is. Well, that's a key point. What Randy is saying, that on a national basis, you could be cutting spending in half. Now, you may not be able to do this in single-payer programs in the states. It may not be possible to cut it in half, but it might be possible to cut it to cut it by 35%. So you're only spending 65%, as much. Right? Doesn't that sound like it's reasonable? How about that for an argument? Is that going to be possible in Washington through the whole Washington Trust program? I don't know. I am waiting for Jerry Friedman's latest cost estimates, but I understand that they're coming. He says, let me ask you a question on the resource front. Nurses and doctors and specialists, a finite supply of them. And so he asks, the supply problem. So people have to drive hours to get care. The question is, do we really have the care where it's needed? Do we have enough of the specialists, to provide the services, not just the administration staff, so to speak? So Randy says, yeah. So because we rely so much on markets, and not nearly enough on any kind of national planning, we have huge failures throughout the system. We have far too many people working in the insurance part, or the selling, processing claims, actually denying claims. All of that stuff is using up the labor resources. Those people could have been trained instead to actually provide health care or do something else, but useful, because the insurance part of this is not useful at all. It's profitable, but it's not socially useful, and it would go away if we had Medicare for all, and then those who do go into the actual medical care delivery also react to incentives. The pay is much higher to be a specialist, so we have areas where there are plenty of doctors who provide that special care. So Randy goes on with this and points up that it's because of the market-based system that we run into that problem. So it's the whole system that is a problem, he says. Planning every hospital of any size has to have the most expensive equipment in order to attract the patients or the specialized care, even though the equipment is not going to be used very much because it's very specialized. But everyone has to have that, so that increases the cost. Rather than if you had a more planned system, we could get away with fewer of these the specialized expensive equipments. And you mentioned large parts of the country, rural areas are greatly underserved. So we end up with hospitals in the urban areas. That's the way the market works. So relying less on the market would allow us to have a system that serves people much better, so that you could get care out of the rural areas. So what's Randy saying? He's talking about the need for planning. He's talking about the need for some socialism and the need to get away from the market. He says he drove across the country 3 times recently, the whole distance, and he was shocked at what rural America looks like. He says he's driven across the country many, many times in my life, and the desperation you see in rural America, when you get that way far away from the interstates, it's amazing. The towns are abandoned. The houses are abandoned. There will typically be one big nice house with lots of very expensive farming equipment. The school is gone. The stores are gone. They're all boarded up and falling down. And it's part of the problem of not having the services. And then you get Trump, who wants to close all the post offices. And the whole philosophy behind having the post office was that they don't have to make profit, but we're going to have them everywhere. We should have the same philosophy about good medical facilities, and they don't have to make profits, but they need to be everywhere so that people can get health care where they live and don't have to move away. Same with schools. So Steve asks yet another question. That when the rich move out or the corporations move out, it's tax revenue that the local jurisdiction loses out on, and that the state also lose out on, and schools as well, are going to lose out on. But if I'm right, it sounds like there's another problem here baked into this. As we try and save money by extension, we're also costing the state money. Is there any truth in that? Randy says, yeah, so you mentioned donut holes. There's a lot of analysis of the creation of these so-called holes in the center of cities where infrastructure is older. It's expensive. So you raise the tax rates, so people start to move out to the suburbs, which have new infrastructure, so costs are lower. But Catamount played a big role in this, in helping, to promote the white flight to the suburbs by helping to pay for the good rolls that could allow you to commute in from suburbs. And it's housing policy, that helped to promote it. it's a vicious cycle. The tax base is declining. They have to start cutting things, and the quality of schooling starts to deteriorate. The quality of all the infrastructure deteriorates. Services deteriorate. So they got to raise the tax rate so more people leave. I think that is happening in rural areas too now. It's not donut holes that you're abandoning the middle part of the country and tax revenue goes down, which means the services get worse, which then promotes but further emigration out to the cities and the coast and so on, so that dynamic falling tax revenue or increased tax rates makes things really difficult. And then he gets to the eviction crisis, okay, and the homelessness, okay, and the problems there. So Randy says, I agree it's going to be a very difficult fall and winter from the very beginning when Trump was I'm starting to propose to send out checks to everyone. I was arguing that was the wrong approach, that it should have been targeted and they should have formulated a serious policy to take care of the evictions and foreclosures. So the $5 trillion that was spent, far more of it should have gone to finding I don't mean a permanent solution, but really resolving the inevitable wave of evictions and foreclosures that's going to occur. They started occurring now. You have also to understand the landlord situation. Not all landlords are terrible people, and we've got to resolve the problems for them too. They have their mortgages, okay, and preventing evictions is just postponing a huge problem with the mortgage payments by the owners, whether they're living there or not. So we should have done that from the very beginning if nothing is done. And I think the scenario that we're going to have falling tax revenues and increasing costs of taking care of the homeless that right now are borne by cities. So, he talks a little more about that, okay, in the Day of Reckoning. And, they're all agreed that these, okay, are problems for the United States. And they conclude, of course, by saying that the problem, okay, is national. And he thinks, speaking of Randy now, well, I think the broad-based Green New Deal is a start, okay, and that is Medicare for all, job guarantee. I think we should add a guarantee for everyone to housing, food, clothing, education, okay, and also to have reparations for Native Americans and for African Americans. All those things are a step in the right direction. That has to be national. All of those, the federal government can afford it. It requires the kind of coordination that can only be done at the national level with input from state and local governments, with participation by the for-profit private sector. But you need a leader, and you need a leader who can mobilize the resources without a financial constraint. And that is how they end. So, okay, I want to make the point that Randy did not use the race to the bottom that is going on in certain places, okay, to say that should be an argument against having single payer in the states. He recognized that is a real process, okay, that exists, but he did not say that having single payer inside of the states would be likely to accelerate the race to the bottom. And many of his remarks suggested that if states want to go single payer, there might well be movements from one state to another, creating what I've been calling a race to the top, okay, in that particular situation. Okay, going all the way back to the beginning, it is that short statement that Randy made at the start when talking about the currency. Okay, and he said states have to pay for things. They either have to tax, okay, or they have to borrow, okay, in order to pay for things. Okay, and the paying for things at the state level, okay, the borrowing, okay, is much, much harder. Okay, it's harder to borrow at the state level, okay, than at the federal level. So states have far more constraints. But he also pointed out that what you can have, okay, at the state level as well that can bring in revenue are state enterprises that can bring in revenue for the states. State enterprises, I suppose, possible that actually generate revenue. So I want you to keep your mind focused on that. Okay. Okay, and then what I want you to do is to consider what whole Washington is. Whole Washington is an insurance trust, which is going to be the single payer for healthcare in Washington, but should it pass. That single payer program expects that from its various sources of funds. So Lana asks, what are state enterprises to bring in revenue? Well, if you really look at it, whole Washington would be a state enterprise. And it would be an enterprise created by state law to pay for health care for the citizens of the state. And that enterprise does expect to be in surplus from the start. In other words, it expects to bring in more revenue than it spends. Other things being equal, therefore, what Washington will have is a source of revenue in terms of taxes. It perhaps can also borrow from time to time, okay, at least a small amount. But it also will have a state enterprise that is likely to create a surplus, a year after year surplus. In fact, the cost estimates are beginning to show that those surpluses will not be small, that they will be sizable. And that whole Washington, Laura Fielding points out here, we are awaiting Jerry Friedman's new analysis. But the old analysis was showing nearly $12 billion surplus annually. A state enterprise bringing in revenue. Now that revenue would not be going into the regular budgetary process of the state. It would be going into the whole Washington Trust. And that money would be sitting in a bank, that surplus. And when the second year came around, that surplus would be even larger. And the surpluses would accumulate over time. And before too many years passed, I'm talking about just a few years, there might be enough of an accumulated surplus to pay for a whole year's spending, even if there was no income from the payroll taxes, okay, or other financial sources. Well, so Laura says, no, the old analysis was $9 billion. The new study is suggesting nearly $12 billion. Okay, well, we'll see what the new study suggests at the time the new study comes out. Okay, but it's a substantial surplus, okay, in any case. And I'm really anxious to see what that final estimate is. Okay, but if it is that way, and if more and more surpluses, okay, are in the offing, then the whole Washington Trust will be able to withstand recessions and even a depression. Because even if the payroll in Washington would decrease, let's say by as much as a third, 2/3 of the payroll taxes would still remain. And the part of those payroll taxes which are earmarked for whole Washington would still be going into whole Washington. There will always be some revenue coming in. And it would not take too many years for whole Washington to be strong enough to withstand any depression, even if it's one that is quite unlikely to occur. In other words, that program, in a very short time, would be rock solid and would be in a position to survive, even if there was not additional federal aid forthcoming. Okay, now, I have to point out that the cost estimates, and the revenue estimates do include a substantial amount of tapping of the federal revenue sources. And I'll go into that when I talk to Georgia Davenport, but far more deeply, than I have here. But I expect that those revenue sources, are going to account for more than, let's take the example of the kind of money Washington, is spending now. Let's assume that it could save roughly, let's say 30%, or 31% of savings, compared to what, it's spending now. Now of the remaining 70% still to be accounted for, the federal revenue sources are likely to account for 60 to 65% of it. So, whole Washington certainly looks like it would be easily able to supply the remaining revenue from its own revenue sources. But we await the final estimates, from Jerry Friedman, or at least the update for 2021. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to consider your comments. So here we go. Let's go back to the beginning. There are lots of comments, and I'm going to follow my usual practice. I can do reading them all out. So I guess I'm going to pick this up at roughly 9:15. So Jeff Denton says that's supposedly how fall asleep that Joe Biden actually got elected, because he's not Trump. And Alvera Mihalko says, what exactly is MMT? It's modern money theory or modern monetary theory. It can stand for either. The title, of Randy Wray's book is actually Modern Money Theory. But most people refer to it, okay, um, but actually modern monetary theory. Evelina says, I love you fell asleep on Bennett. Just perfect to laugh out loud. And said, Carmen, you upgraded from your beatnik, the black beret to the progressive red beret. It's meant for you. Well, thank you, Carmen. But I do have to say that I never actually owned a black beret. I was not a beret beatnik type. I generally hate hats. I've never worn a hat. I can honestly say this is the only hat I've ever liked. Evelyn says, hi, Elvira, welcome. Jeff says you can use your search engine and find it. Explains how all new spending is basically invented money with no collateral. But if you don't explain it how the condescending people want you to, it's all wrong. So I just suggest you look it up. Jeff says, exactly, not a functioning democracy. Laura says, just shared a link out on that highly populated Twitter thread. Thank you, Laura. That's wonderful. Evelina says, modern monetary theory, it's how feds pay for things such as infrastructure, healthcare, transition to clean energy, without either borrowing, okay, or taxing. Okay, says, the rich need to pay their fair share too, MMT or not. They do need to pay their fair share, as Stephanie explained, if only for the health, okay, of our democracy, and also for the fact that they need to pay their fair share. We all agree on that. But what she's saying is, if you get yourself into a political situation in Congress where people absolutely will not vote for the taxing offsets, that's no reason to stop trying to get the spending. In other words, what we know is that the offsets don't really pay for anything. So if they insist on not putting in the offsets, then you say to them, you don't get what you want unless you give us the spending that we want. That's the way you bargain with them. Evelina says, big crowd in Indiana, I read. Kay says, Bernie was live from Detroit today. Great. Evelina says, agreed, but for a different reason than paying for a federal program. Jeffrey Denton has left an icon I cannot read from my interface. And Lana says, Carmen, I have to learn to be more of a minimalist. And Carmen says, Lana, you should see my room. I made a wall storage unit, a side table area, a mini fridge pedestal, so I don't have to bend low, a microwave cart, and dish storage out of milk crates, and $1 zip ties. Oh, you're very creative, Carmen. Lana says, you remember the date of your first Stephanie presentation? Wow. Well, that's not such a hard trick, because the idea for that conference, okay, was mine. It was in response to the announcement of the Peterson Fiscal Summit that was due to be scheduled on April 28th of 2010. On April 9th, I came up with that idea, but put together a team of people, and but together with the cooperation of the MMTers, we put together a teach-in counter conference in Washington, D.C. at George Washington, but just across town from the Peterson conference, running on the same day as a teach-in counter conference, okay, to their conference. We wanted to have that teach-in counter conference because of the BSing that was going on from the Peterson Foundation and from the Obama administration about austerity. We felt it was imperative to have that particular counter conference. That conference was made up of only MMTers, all MMTers. Bill Mitchell was there, so was Warren Mosler, Stephanie Kelton, but Randy Wray was there, but Pavlina, okay, and Marshall Auerbach. And we had a wonderful day. Their presentations were all wonderful. We had audience participation you would not believe. After every presentation, we had at least a half hour of questions from the floor. The MMTers were peppered from all over the floor, and they handled every question and they threw it back. It was an amazing performance, okay, on their part. It was an amazing performance. And the videos are still on YouTube. They're still on YouTube, and they are worth watching. A lot of the attacks on MMT that you see today were made actually there at that conference. And a lot of the answers you see today from the MMTers came out of that particular conference. And the presentations by Stephanie and Warren, really magnificent presentations. All of them were high quality. But did I say there was a Marshall Auerbach presentation? His presentation was on inflation and Weimar and Zimbabwe. Terrific presentation on it. Evelyn says she breaks it down so beautifully. Lana says, pretty good. I have watched plenty of the shorter clips from that panel. Simply fabulous. Oh, you did watch it. You did watch it. Carmen Muniz says, and nice shelving boards. Oh, and by the way, the clips from that panel, there was full capture of the Q&As. It's all there. All the interactions, okay, with the audience there. And there were many people within the audience who graduated to blogging MMT after that conference. Carmen says, and nice shelving boards that I found around here, so when I move, I disassemble them. And I already pretty much packed up. I rarely buy anything anymore. Carmen says, much damn autocorrect. And Lana says, yep, Warren's raised the revenue needed to invest. No. Wrong way to phrase. Yes, it's a no. It's a no. Carmen Muniz says, where are you moving to from? And Lana says, I was raised by a depression baby who couldn't afford much and repurposed a lot, but this can't be carried too far. I ended up paying multiple times to move stuff I don't use and don't need, trying to weed out. Carmen says, go start, his name is Steve, wherever I can find a spot. I'm not stationary, but for now, I'm staying in place due to overwhelming COVID in Florida. I don't even go out except for provisions. That's probably very wise because of Delta. Delta. We are pulling in our ears right now here. We are being very, very careful now. Carmen says, gotcha, Lana. I have a huge bag of lentils, garbanzo beans, and more that I'm trying to donate. Depression food. I got a lot of garbanzo beans here also. And I got a lot of lentils too. Jeffrey says, this eye roll was for when Joe is quoting Jayapal, who won't acknowledge whole Washington exists, but that blamed the vote. People strangely, oddly, weirdly don't even look in her direction. It is weirdly. Lana says, at Carmen, Ghostart says, hear that. I bailed on a 5 a.m. empty store egg run today. I think I'm just going to have everything delivered from now on if I can figure it out online. I'll laugh out loud. BL says, please explain what MMT is in simple terms. I never grasped it. Thank you. Okay, you can explain it in simple terms, but you cannot explain it in 2 minutes. You can't explain it adequately in 5 minutes, though some people have certainly tried. Now, I do intend soon, okay, in this particular live stream, to give the basics of MMT, okay, as I understand them. I'm developing the slides now. I expect I'm looking at a 4 or 5 hour presentation, which will be spread over some days, but it's going to be fairly comprehensive. Okay. There are references where people try to explain it in a much but shorter amount of time. But Stephanie Kelton has plenty, videos where she's doing 15 and 20-minute presentations that summarize modern monetary theory. I can do the same thing that she can, with respect to it. But it's very easy to look at some of those videos of hers, and I recommend, you do that because she is great at it. There's nobody better than her at doing that. And Lana says, at BL, have you ever read Stephanie's book? The Deficit Myth. The Deficit Myth. It's an easy read and also, an Audible. Yeah, and if you're looking for detailed explanations, of the Deficit Myth, I've done 9 live streams on that relatively short book in order to amplify. All the 9 live streams, are at the YouTube site, and you can locate them. They were done in June and early July of 2019, just after the book appeared. I think it appeared in 2019, didn't it? Was it 2000? No, it wasn't 2020. I think it was 2019. And so BL says, I would check to see if my library has her book. It probably does have her book by now because it was an economics bestseller. So it should be easy to get. And Lana says, love Dr. Randall Wray. And Carmen says, yeah, go start. I soak myself constantly in hand sanitizer when I go out and about. Cut squares from my carbon filter air purifier to slide in my mask. Stores are closing their bathrooms again due to coronavirus. Yeah, Florida's a very bad place to be now. I'm not so sure Virginia's a great place to be either. The state's been having lots of problems lately. And Fran says, beloved the beret. Thanks, Doc. Thank you, Fran. And Lana says, at BL, I promise it's worth the read. Her video called Angry Birds, is also excellent. Yes, it is. But her talk to the patriotic, the patriotic millionaires is also a great introductory talk. And MMT, I really like that one as well. And Carmen says, Joseph Firestone read and covered Stephanie Kelton's new book in this live stream earlier this year. Well, as I said, it was actually, I think now it's a couple of years since I covered it, but at least a year since I covered it. So, yes, it is all free. It says, BF, I'll have to go that. I just found Dr. Firestone recently. I don't know why it took so long. I could say a word or two about that, but I don't think I'm going to bother. And Lana says, happy to have you, BL. Hi, Fran. And Fran says, hi, Lana. Thanks, Doc. Laura says, still with you. That's great, Laura. I'm glad that you are still here as of 9:54. I hope you're still here at 11:09, which is what it is now. Lana says, I'm thinking of Martin Watts because Charlie Watts, drummer for Rolling Stone, just passed away. He isn't as visible as the others, like Phil Lawn. I hope he is well. Super nice guy. Are you talking Phil Lawn, super nice guy, or Martin Watts? Or both? And Carmen says, so if state banks get hacked, states are pretty much ruined, right? Because those accounts aren't FDIC insured, or are they? There's only one state bank. In other words, there's only one public bank that's owned by a state. That is the Bank, of North Dakota. If I recall correctly, that is not an FDIC insured bank, but I don't think there's any reason why state banks could not become part of the Federal Reserve System and be FDIC insured. It's just that the State Bank of North Dakota has never been. CoStar said surfs up. Who's Randy? Randy Wray, L. Randall Wray, one of the top 3 people, okay, in MMT. Or maybe it's more appropriate to say now that it's a top 4 group of people that include Stephanie, and because of the extremely great job she did at communicating it, okay, in her book. Okay, says we need better education, not less. Fran Sylvia's daughter says, I need MMT for Dummies. The simplest MMT book that you can get at this point, okay, is The Deficit Myth. It's intended to be read by anyone who can read, say, the New York Times. So, Fran, I'm kind of sure if you read that you like it, okay, and that you understand it. And what you don't understand, you can bring up with me, and I will explain it. Now, Mitchell and Watts are from Australia, Lana, that's right. And Lana says, awesome. Yarmouth talked to Randy first. I love it. I don't know whether it was clear that he talked to Randy first, but he certainly seems to have gotten an awful lot from his talking with Randy. And Lana says, I'll be happy to spend 15 or so minutes on the phone with people who want the kindergarten version. Have you got a good kindergarten version that you can give in 15 minutes, Lana? I'd like to see that then. And Fran says, beginner level. And Lana says, I think the government is both the problem and the solution. I think he was referring to Reagan. Laura says, we actually need to increase our numbers, activists. So Steve Grumbine should share with us his plan of growing our base, okay, of activists. I don't know what Steve's current plan is, okay, for activists, but I had a lot of experience, okay, in a management group there some time ago. And my advice to you, Laura, is come up with your own plan for increasing your base, okay, of activists. And Lana said, Laura says, heard, thank you, exactly so, Joe, hashtag FOAF, by Red Berets, Medicare for All, and not giving up. I actually just really got a great idea for Red Berets, hashtag MFT, hashtag FOAF, visually reaching our reps. That is great, Laura. I'm anxious to hear about it. Kay says, we all need fair voting districts too. We absolutely do. Carmen says, I just hope that residual rescue money to the states will help those getting evicted now that the stupid Supreme Court shot everybody down. Well, what I hope is that Congress quickly repeals this decision by the Supreme Court. Just quickly puts through, just passes a moratorium that is the law and that takes care of both the landlords and also the tenants. Lana says, apparently there's a bunch of dollar states are hoarding that was supposed to go to help with this problem. But from what I read only today, as of just a few days ago, about 11% of $46 billion had been dispersed by the states. That's all. Only 11%. So only about $6 billion out of the $46 billion off the top of my head. Right? That's all. So there's what? $40 billion still left? Kay says, trying for fair districts here in Ohio. Sandy Digg says, nice hat. Sandy, ain't it a great hat? It's a great beret. And Jeff Denton says, when the globalists that control the healthcare industry and all of the media froze support for Medicare for all at 70%, 4 years ago, which once again nobody is talking about, it was at 52% among all Republicans. And of course, that has gone up or remained strangely frozen during a pandemic. Yep. I wonder about that too, Jeff. Carmen says, oh, yes, racist states will deny aid to their citizens if it should benefit people of color. But America is apartheid. Lana says, glad you mentioned onepayerstates.org. We'll be mentioning it a lot more, Lana. Carmen says, right, Lana. Imagine the COVID in the streets when people are out in the elements, not to forget cholera and such, when folks have to defecate in the immediate environment and then end up in jail. Kay says, we all want M4A. And Laura says, plus we need to reveal the neoliberal governors who are blocking single payer in their states. For example, Newsom and Inslee. Yeah, Newsom has certainly been doing that. He promised it, and he's been blocking it. Sandy Degg says, shared. And Laura says, Republican voters need to see how Dems are actually against single payer. The media lies and gaslights them. Yes, that's exactly right. I think you mean the Dems, okay, who are in office, okay, because the primary voters, okay, among the Dems are overwhelmingly for single payer. It's the most overwhelming thing you've ever seen in polling. Alana says, wow, Randy's answer, interesting take. Indeed. It was an interesting take, wasn't it? That's the solution. Let her move into the single payer states and forget about those other states. Sandy says, we have to pay a fee to leave the state of New Jersey. You what? You have to pay a fee?
Well, I never heard that.
How would they know if you left and paid the fee? Amazing. Jeff says, whole Washington's plan covers you even if you come to Washington State, but temporarily to work. Great. Kay says, why, Sandy Degg? I say, how, Sandy Degg? Carmen says, why are Californians running to Texas? Isn't that jumping out of the frying pan into the fire? Yeah, I think it certainly is. Sandy Degg says, I think Christie put that into effect. Republicans. Kay says, how high is the fee to leave New Jersey? And how is the state going to collect it once the people are out? Kay says, shake my head, that sucks. Sandy says, yes, it does. Carmen says, Californians. Evelina says, as if the federal government can't afford to provide the best public services to people out in the rural areas. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. Of course it can afford it. It creates its own money. Of course it can afford it. Kay says, we have a couple of local households in our area that have been closed. They need to open them again to deal with COVID and the rest of the people who need other health care, emergency care. Evelina says, what is wrong with the federal government? Kay says it's broken, Evelina. Yes, the neoliberals broke it. They broke it over 40 years. They broke it. It was halfway broken during the 1970s. Then starting with Reagan, the neoliberals broke it entirely, both the Republican neoliberals and the Democratic neoliberals. Every Republican president since then, every Democratic president since then, including Biden, has been a neoliberal. Laura says, hashtag Red Berets, hashtag FOAF, which means fight on all fronts or fighting on all fronts, and hashtag MMT. Yes, those are our three hashtags in solidarity because single payer in the states is going to need federal funds, and we're going to have to facilitate that at the federal level. Actually, from the beginning, we must see to it that there are no roadblocks in the way of current law, which does allow states to tap into federal funding. Lana says, what are state enterprises to bring in revenue? Carmen says, like legalized sports spending. And Laura points out that the expected surplus now is $12 billion annually. Evelyn says people out in the rural areas have been continually served with the lie that being provided with the most basic public services means government, they will intervene in your affairs. That is a lie. Government doesn't have to intervene in your affairs. Evelyn says such BS. And Jeffrey Denton says Jamin was ratified as vice chair of the People's Party of Washington State. Who is Jamin or Jamin? And Laura Fielding says no. The old analysis was $9 billion annually. The new study suggests nearly $12 billion. Lana says so. The payroll tax would be part of this. Specified for the medical program, versus the regular budget. Yeah, the plan I've seen calls for 8.5% payroll tax, okay, on employers. That would represent the 50% saving over what the employers are paying now, because the cost for the health care has been averaging 17% of payroll, so the 8.5% is half of that. There would also be a rise in the payroll tax for the employees, 2% of payroll. So it's a fairly minor rise. And here's Bonnie.
I'm going to
is coming
show you.
to sit. She's going to put on the big hat again. Okay, I think this hat is similar to the one Sheriff Snuggs has. Okay, it's pretty cool. It's really pretty cool, but let me see if I can make it a little more rakish. I like it a little more rakish.
How's mine?
Oh, yours is beautiful. Hang on a second. I'm going to fix our camera.
He said I'm beautiful.
So you were fully in the picture. Yes, I did.
Okay.
Kay says, yes, it is BS, Evelina. And Evelina says, makes me mad. And Kay says, me too. And Cook came in. I hate this. I'm sorry, I just scrolled down. I scrolled down too fast. Okay, I'm going to scroll up. And okay, here we are. We're back. I'm back at 10:50. I scrolled down too fast. Kay says, me too. You ought to live here, Evelina Pont. Sandy says, could a state like New Jersey be able to do what the state of Washington is doing? I believe so, Sandy. And the reason why I believe so is if the cost estimates of Washington are right, they mean in the larger picture that all states will be able to save money on healthcare. The individuals will be able to save money, the businesses will be able to save money, and the states themselves will actually spend less. So that means that each state will increase the degree of its fiscal sustainability when it adopts a single payer program like the Washington program. Bonnie's having a ball here.
I'm going to put this one on me and this one on you.
Okay, that's fine.
Where's that? Oh, okay. No, that's not working.
Okay, wait a
You
minute.
do it.
Okay. Okay, did that work?
That's better.
Oh, thank you.
And this I'll have to wear like this.
Kay says, not opening these small hospitals to help people is just stupid and cruel. Yes, it is.
It is. It
And
is.
Laura Fielding says, Sandy, let's make sure you ask Georgia Davenport if she's specifically working with any of the organizers in New Jersey. Yes, and remember, Georgia is now scheduled to interview with me 1 week from this coming Tuesday. So what is that? This is 29th, 30th, 31st. That should be September 6th. I think it's Tuesday, September 6th. Does that sound right?
Whatever you want.
September 3rd is Friday. 4th. No, that's actually Monday.
Monday.
No, it can't be Monday. It's got to be Tuesday, September 7th. Because I only do Mondays, very special programs. So Jeffrey Netton says, you would have to find out if you can run a ballot initiative in New Jersey. Okay, in a lot of states you can't. That's right.
Who do you contact to do that?
Okay, but of course the same law, though, could be passed, okay, in Jersey if they could get the legislature to pass it. Right, Jeff? Kay says, okay, I don't think they're going to readily pass it, okay, in Jersey, but this is what I do think. If the New York Health Act were to pass, okay, and then if Jersey thought it could create a compact, okay, with New York, to join with New York, to go to the federal government, ask for waivers under the ACA, essentially proposing a common program for the two states. Okay, in other words, the financing would be separate for each of the states, but the program would be the same. Okay, and if they organize that with the state compact, I kind of think that New Jersey would tag along, okay, with New York, and would be happy to get that same program. And not only them, I think a bunch of New England states would come in, and I think Pennsylvania would come in too. And I think eventually that aggregate of states would reach as far south as Virginia and perhaps even but North Carolina. But that's my vision. Kay says, we can't here in Ohio. I just found out. Don't we look resplendent in our berets? Isn't that fantastic? Yeah, that looks pretty good on you.
That looks
You're
kind
really
of good.
Sandy says, you look good in the hat. Laura says, Joe, that's a big compliment. I do think you wear the beret well. Also, Georgia Davenport will be ecstatic that you are helping as a red beret all about old Washington and other one-payer states could likely be a race to the top. Well, that's one of my big points, that there is going to be a race to the top and not a race to the bottom.
If we can get enough
Lana says,
states,
yeah.
If we can get enough states to decide to go, try to go for Medicare for all, it might embarrass Biden that he isn't moving with us.
I don't think Biden embarrasses very well.
No.
Or very easily. But on the other hand, he is moved by overwhelming numbers on the other side and by harassment. So maybe we can look forward to doing something there. I think, though, the first problem is getting rid of Nancy Pelosi. Once you get rid of her and you get somebody who's from Medicare for All as the Speaker of the House,
Vacate.
then a lot of harassment can come from that side of things. Lana says, Dr. Joe, Bernie sure looked like he was campaigning in Indiana yesterday. Felt like old times. The audio and video in the beginning were awful. Seemed like a bad connection, but overall, okay, it was very good. And Laura says, teach all about, and also that you are clarifying that whole Washington as well as Red Berets are not giving up. The pressure will remain high as always. Fighting on all fronts. Hashtag FOAF. You bet. And so BL says KOCH.
That's it.
I think that refers to the former mayor of New York, right? And Lana says, who are the names of the presentations? What are the names of the presentations so people can look it up? I'm going to have to look up the links again, and I did have them at my fingertips at one time. I can leave them in the comments so people can get the links. Sandy says, each hashtag, each one, teach one. Thank you, Sandy. Laura says, phonema daily through organizing and action. This is why Whole Washington was the first coalition partner at M for All, alongside the Red Berets M4A coalition. Sandy says, you explain MMT beautifully, Joe. Thank you, Sandy. But I've never tried to explain it in 5 minutes or even in 15 minutes. Okay, there's something, about my mind. It just tends towards complexity. It just does. If I do anything like sending out a simple tweet, I really, really, really have to be careful to trim that tweet. It's incredible for me. Lana says, I think this calls for a Red Berets Twitter thread where I link each of your live streams with a Red Beret craftism image. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Laura. I said, this we could bookmark and keep retweeting it, so I'll work on this tomorrow. That would be fantastic, Laura. Fantastic. And BL says, hashtag power to the people. As of 11:09, still here. Ideas coming to me. Fran Bauer, I'll send you a copy. Yes, I guess that's Fran, Sylvia's daughter, right? And Lana says, I have given, quote, the kindergarten, unquote, version, but many times the co-workers. Okay, give it to me sometime. I'd like to hear the kindergarten version that you give. Lana says, yes, C, M4A, and FOAF. BL says, you rock, Dr. Firestone. Thanks, Doc. Thank you, BL, and thank you for coming. And Kate says, Congress is about useless, shake my head. And Lana says, agreed, BL. Sandy says, looking sharp, Joe. Thank you, Sandy. Lana says, off topic, I am discovering the Dulles brothers. Oh my, you mean John Foster and Alan Dulles? Oh. BL says, Medicare for all. Now, Laura says, yes. I definitely meant the elected Dems, and BL sends an icon 4 times that I cannot see in this interface. Lana says, years of feed in New Jersey when you spell your house of your new address is intended to be out of what? Oh, God. Sandy says, not sure. I think it's like an exit tax. How much is it out of the states?
How can they
It's 1%, I think, you pay on the closing statement. I don't think it applies to renters. Probably can't apply to renters because they can't track. I mean, a lot of times. And Carmen says, hashtag, just kidding. And Lana says, I hate this keyboard. People who own property in Jersey who give their addresses out of state after pay 1% of their sales tax, I believe is the closing fee, they can check up with your next state return. How come they get access to that state return? Jeffrey says, Jamin Mason is a Red Beret, lives in Port Orchard, Washington, on the peninsula. Hooray for Jamin. Terry says, 6 years ago, John Nicholson, Citizens for Restructured Government, called me up to say, Terry Cook, I must leave this country, no longer able to afford the protection to keep me alive. This was after hundreds of hours of phone conversation in 4 years. That left a giant hole in my weekly ability to converse with a brilliant mind on the subject of how we fix what we have allowed on our watch. Then came along fellow Buckeye Marine to our last breath, running for the U.S. Senate in Washington D. And BL says, hashtag power to the people right now. Jeffrey waves a bunch, and Sandy says, uh-oh.
What'd you do?
I scrolled too fast. Jeffrey Denton is waving, and says, wow, no, that's a hat. It is, isn't it? And Dolores says, she sends 2 hearts. And Sandy says, but Bonnie, you are beautiful. That is a great hat, isn't it?
It's a great hat.
And Lana says, you guys are so cute. Well, thank you. We really have a wonderful time together.
He looks like he has an umbrella on his head.
And Evelyn says, lovely Bonnie,
That's cute.
but you're a natural.
He's cute. Isn't he cute?
And the look says beautiful. Has the wine gone to your head? And Dolores says, the beautiful Sandy throws 3 hearts our way. Thank you, Sandy. Karen says, Highlander, there can be only one, laugh out loud. Reference the Scottish hat. Yes.
Yeah.
Carmen says, Bonnie in her bonnet. Laura Fielding says, taking screenshots. Let's get a smooch, Bonnie and Joe. How about it? Okay, let's get a smooch. Hope you got that smooch. And Jeffrey said, Joe, I have gone door to door canvassing for national nurses wearing my red beret.
Right.
I have lobbied several times wearing it, and people actually love it. I'll bet they do. I'll bet they do love it. And Deborah says, hi, Joe and Bonnie. I just got back to my room from spending the day with Caleb Mopan. And Caleb Mopan is somebody who has, last time I saw him, he was a reporter for RT, not just a reporter. He was also a commentator for RP, columnist. He's a very brilliant young man, in my opinion. I like what he does. And Sandy says, but you two are way too cute. Thank you. And Mopan and his CPI. CPI? I know what CPI usually means. It's the cost of living indicator, consumer price index. But is that what Caleb is talking about a lot these days? Laura says, you both look beautiful in your berets. Imagine learning MMT could be so fun. I guess we're just the MMT couple, right?
Yeah.
Sandy says, Bonnie is a hottie. Well, I always thought so. BL says, who made the hats?
Not me.
Okay, 2 of the berets were made by Laura Fielding, who is here with us tonight, and the other 2 were made by Michelle de Villiers.
Thank you both.
Whose name I hope I pronounced correctly. I did take a lot of French a long time ago, but I think I have still retained my ability to do some pronunciation fairly decently, so hopefully I've pronounced her name correctly. Sandy Degg says, down with the queen of ice cream, indeed. Kathy L. says, nice to see Bonnie get in the picture. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
And Carmen says, thorough, in-depth show again. My hat is off. Thank you, Carmen. Evelina says, I think Bonnie is right. Biden doesn't like feeling embarrassed. He's getting dissed a lot lately.
Yes, he is. Big time.
And somebody, speaking of Nancy Pelosi, said, again, I scrolled down too rapidly. Sorry about that, but I am almost where I need to be here.
What are you laughing at?
I'm laughing at something that I read. And Jeffrey said she's got $600 of it, $600 worth of it in her freezer. And a lot of us never got a $600 stimulus. Yeah, we've been missing a $600 check as well. We are shortly filing our taxes, which should enable us to recapture the $600.
Yeah,
Evelina says, Jeffrey Denton, she is shameless. Yeah, she is. She is shameless. Honey, you were about to say?
they didn't know I was alive.
Who didn't know you were alive?
The government.
Oh, the government, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, except they had no trouble paying you the original $1,200
Right.
and then the later $1,400.
Right.
They had no trouble with that.
Right.
Somehow they had a trouble with the $600. I'll tell you the truth, I don't think that was them.
I thought it was 800.
No, it was $600.
Okay.
I don't think that was them. I think it was Louis DeJoy
Oh.
that caused that problem.
Oh.
And Jeffrey Denton says back when he was lucid, Joe Biden attacked Social Security 10 times between 1983 and 2018. So I'm pretty sure he has no shame either. Yes, and his mother needed that Social Security too.
When is Biden going to do something about the joy? I'm waiting.
I have no idea. I don't know what the hell is holding him up there. Sandy says, I don't know. I haven't left yet, but laugh out loud. And BL says, where did you and Bonnie meet? We met up in Buffalo at the very end of 1965 at a bar and restaurant known as Cole's, where the cool people went every Wednesday and every Friday to meet. And we met on a Wednesday night.
And he wore a jacket with things on the elbows, and I thought he was poor.
Yeah, when I took Bonnie out to dinner the first time, which was the night after that,
yeah,
she thought that I wasn't going to be able to make the price of dinner.
And I was so glad I had just gotten paid.
She thought that maybe she could help if we needed to get out of there without washing the dishes. Solana says, if you don't file a New Jersey state tax return for the next year, re-exit fee.
Ooh.
Parmenina says, can or con.
Isn't that against the law?
And Evelina says, Jeffrey Denton, that was then. Jeff says, I was clapping at your red berets. It was a clapping emoji. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Sandy Degg sends 4 hearts. Laura Fielding says, I did capture the smooch. Had to put my knitting down, but it was worth it. Deborah Wilson says, Center for Political Innovation. Well, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Please send me the link, Deborah. I'll Google it and pick it up anyway, because I'm all for political innovation. That's what we need right now. And Jeff says, so Joe turned good and Bernie turned bad? I think you're talking about Joe Biden turned good and Bernie turned bad somehow, I doubt. And Dolores Pierce says, I captured the smooch as well. Thank you, Dolores.
Thank you.
Laura Fielding says, you're welcome. I'm sure I speak for Michelle de Villiers as well. Carmen says, you two are no ordinary love. Well, we can't say anything about that. All we know is what we have.
Yeah.
And Laura says, let's compare photos on Twitter, Dolores Spears, and we'll find the best photo. I'm sure both are cute. Well, I can tell you right now, that's not the best we can do. Lana says, Nancy is more than shameless. She's also clueless. About some things, she is clueless. Carmen says, that's where our $600 went to designer ice cream. Evelina says, yes, you know the old corduroy jackets with the elbow patches on them that were made in Poland during the 1960s? Well, I had one of those.
I got rid of it.
Okay, and I was, in those days, I was frequently teaching at, at either one of the universities, or another. And of course, it was fashionable for professors to wear their elbow patches. In fact, I was in the university world until about 1975. And then we came down here to D.C. And after that, my career was in research and consulting and training after that time. BL says, cool. Carmen Luna says, DeJoy must be blackmailing the Dems. I don't know. BL says, Biden has always been bad. Bernie is good. Well, I don't know if Biden has Biden's been pretty bad. It's like he's got this record over 50 years, nearly 50 years now. I think he came into the Senate in 1973. So it's nearly 50 years. And he has almost an unbroken record of making the wrong decision when it comes to voting.
Why do
or supporting things.
Why do they ask almost every day online if I approve of him?
Oh, if you approve on Joe Biden?
Yeah.
And are you sending them back any encouragement?
No.
Like saying, I don't approve of him?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, so if you say, I don't approve of him, they're constantly surveying you to see if you're going to change your mind.
Right.
So Lana says, DeJoy, wrong name for him, Blech. So we can call him now Blech.
Oh, I like
We'll
that.
call him Louis de Blech. Kay says, well, thank you all for another great discussion. I love you all. I need to go to bed. And we love you, Kay. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Kay. Sleep
well. Carmen says, the jackass and Lana. The joy, the jackass. Lana says, Bonnie does not appear to approve of elbow patches. Laugh out loud. No, she didn't think elbow patches were the thing.
No.
She liked my tweeds better. And Jeff Denton says, best show is awesome, including a lot of smiles and chuckles at the end. Jeff says, this show. Carmen says, laugh out loud, Bonnie, no elbow patches allowed. Sandy says, Biden is a wackadoodle. Laura says, thank you for a great discussion. Thank you very much for coming, Dolores. And thank you for all your sharing. And thank you for all the great support that you've given me over so many months. It is really greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much.
And yours too, Lana. Very much appreciated. BL says Biden is a rapist. I believe Tara Reid. Okay, I got to say that I believe Tara Reid too. I always thought that was fairly authentic. Jeffrey Denton says Biden fell asleep during an interview today. It was really awful when, in 2020, we had a choice of two rapists to vote for. We literally have to decide who was the worst of the two rapists. Dolores says, but you're welcome and good night. And Dolores says he was really a sleepy Joe today. I believe he certainly was. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you for our most fun live stream. Certainly aided and abetted by the wonderful Red Berets. Sandy says, have a wonderful night. Thank you. It's always interesting and fun. Well, thank you, Sandy, for coming.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you as well. Beal says, I wrote Bernie in. Carmen said, it was wonderful seeing you both on tonight. I'm getting some water. Carmen, I hope you investigate what I suggested. They've helped so many people there with advice. And Jeffrey Denton said it started out with Clinton saying, I didn't inhale. Then Bush Jr. got a DUI on cocaine. Then Obama said, I didn't inhale. And then we came to the lesser of Epstein's flight logs. What's next? The best by ritual suicide gets to be president?
Mm-hmm.
Laura says, good night to you both and to all. And good night to you, Laura.
Good night, Laura.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
you for staying for the whole thing.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, everyone. I will see you on Monday night if all goes as planned, because as I announced at the start, by Dan Kaplowitz, candidate for governor of California. Okay, if the recall is successful, he will be the candidate to vote for on question 2, and I'm going to have the honor of interviewing him, okay, on Monday night on a special edition of the In-Depth show. I'm also already scheduled for Tuesday night, a conversation with Sherry Wise. I'm working on getting some other conversations for next week, okay, as well. And for you, Laura, I am working, okay, on Andre Stackhouse, Captain Stack, for Wednesday, Thursday, or Saturday, okay, of next week. So good night to you all, and I'll see you soon.
Good night, all.